criminal and civil law, working in law enforcement as a probation officer and court administrator. As a national training instructor, he taught tribes legal programs and procedures for court and law enforcement. Charles is well versed in drafting tribal local laws, codes, ordinances, policies, and procedures. He holds a partnership in the American Bar Association and American Planners Association. I'd now like to turn the program over to Chuck.
Thank you, John. It's I hope you're having a good morning or afternoon wherever you may be. Certainly, as John had indicated, more than 25 years in different disciplines that all deal with different aspects of risk control. It kind of provided me a unique background. After getting out of the Marine Corps and going into law enforcement, and then from law enforcement going into probation parole, certainly many different opportunities in that type of a setting, criminal justice setting. So, and then after wrapping up that, going into the business world, and then working in that aspect from anything from risk control to planning into executive management. So I've had my fingers in a lot of unique opportunities to be able to hit it on the front line and all the way up into the management end. So, working in different industries from cleaning, contract cleaning. So working with a lot of security issues as it relates to different facilities, right into some of the businesses that I would oversee or manage. So, I hope that you'll be able to take something away from this presentation of something that things that I've learned over the years. So when we look back at this, to start at the very beginning, OSHA defines workplace violence as an act or a threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening or disruptive behaviors that might occur at the work site. And I think that's important because many times we kind of, especially more recently, we're confusing or missing some of the violence aspects because we're talking about either, right now, we're talking about either physical violence or active shooters. So we forget about the other components to it, such as harassment, intimidation, stalking, or sexual harassments. So I think it's important that we do back up and we do recognize that there are multiple levels of violence that we're dealing with in our workplace. So when you look into the different type of aspects, that's going to be gauged on your particular type of industry. If you're doing cash handling, then you're going to have robberies. And so you have to look at your industry specific. And so this hopefully will capture and be able to respond to all types of entities out there, whether it's a business or a public entity, university, healthcare facility, because it's important because there are levels of violence throughout the entire organizations. So NIOSH has taken it a step further, and they've kind of broken down workplace violence into 4 different categories. You've got a criminal intent, or you're dealing with customer clients or co-workers or former co-workers. And then you also have personal relationships on top of that, domestic violence or stalkers. So looking at each of those, it's important as you begin developing your program and your plan that you take into account each one of these categories and you ask as you're going through there to make sure that these are all covered. Because it's not going to just be one isolated area or act of violence that an operation is going to have to be concerned with. So you want to make sure to cover as many bases as possible. And when you start breaking it down, OSHA says that there's over 2 million victims of workplace violence every year. And they're taking it through the whole aspect, the intimidations, the harassments, they're accounting for all of that. So that's a pretty substantial number out there. National Safety Council said that there was 17% of work-related fatalities were related to workplace violences in 2016. 2017, there were more than 18,000 work-related assaults with 458 fatalities. And 2018, that number did another substantial jump, more than almost 21,000 types of assaults, and the same thing, 453 fatalities. Many of those occurred in the healthcare, transportation, or education disciplines. So there's no one workplace more prone to it than another, but these ones, healthcare, transportation, are certainly at the top. Violence is a major cause of death in the workplace, second to transportation facilities or fatalities. So it's important to be able to cover these and look at each of the operations, your operations, and really determine how does this fit and what kind of plan needs to be developed for your particular operation and the protection of your staff and employees. So when they're looking at this, factors that they look at are going to be, is there retail? Is there customer service? Do you work in an isolated area, or do you work alone? Do you have a cash handling business? Does your operation provide personal treatment services and care? Does the operation or staff sell alcohol? Is a late night? Are you 24-hour operation? Where's the location? Are you located in a high crime area, rural area, metropolitan area? And so law enforcement, including security, also has these risks because they're dealing with these on a 24-hour basis. So when you're looking at the types of prevention for the first level that NIOSH identifies, criminal violence, you may want to look at your training programs. And how detailed are these training programs that you have currently in place? Are you also offering a de-escalation training? Many times these start with verbal altercations, being upset. And so being able to have the employee empowered to be able to de-escalate a scenario so that it doesn't escalate to the next stage is going to be very important. So evaluating your training programs is a very good start and something that should be done on a regular basis. There's other aspects you can do by identifying, by having signage identified, whether it's just identifying that there's surveillance cameras on the premise, or whether there's minimal cash handling, or the clerk doesn't have access to the safe. Signage in those circumstances can also help prevent an action from occurring. They might have the thought when they're coming in to maybe do a robbery. However, once they're seeing signs that may steer them out of that direction because they're not there. And it's going to be important. Don't just display signs to try to display them. It's just like having cameras. You want to make sure that everything is fully functional and everything is on up and up. So if you're putting on there that the clerk doesn't have access to the safe, then that should be a policy that's put into actual work, that they do not have that actual access. Making sure that the facility is clear and unobstructed to the registers from the roadway, from sidewalks, from the outside viewing. And your outdoor lighting, sometimes might have to have a lighting expert or a lighting engineer come in and actually double check the illuminations. Lighting is very important when it comes to deterring acts of violence and robberies and thefts. And you also want to be able to eliminate some type of employee isolation. Are they working together? Are they working in pairs? It's important to have look at all those aspects and evaluate each one. Does law enforcement come in on a regular basis? If you are a C-store operator, or do you have a coffee pot available? Let law enforcement know that that's available. They'll put you on their patrol and be able to stop in. And that in itself can help deter something that an individual might see from the outside. The design of some of your points of sale locations or your countertops, reception areas can also help prevent some of the criminal activity. The countertops, are they high enough so that somebody can't jump and clear it? Are they, do they have a blocked access door to the side? So it's not so easy for someone just to run around and take over the register or the individual behind them. Cameras and mirrors are also important. Again, the cameras should be working. Mirrors actually work in two different ways. One, it helps for the end, so that your clerks can see what's happening further down the row. But the other aspect with mirrors that they found is that there is a psychological profile to that. If an individual is looking to do no good and they're in the back corner, if they can see themselves in a mirror, then they feel that others can also see them. So having mirrors placed in strategic locations can help not only the clerks, but it also helps reduce and prevent some of those criminal activities. And of course, limiting your cash on hand or being able to do regular cash drops, making sure you don't keep large quantities of cash in order to be overtaken. When you get dealing with the general public, there's many different types of aspects that you need to look at. And some of those are developing policies and procedures for levels of the violence, whether, what is an early warning sign? So verbal altercations, and will that accelerate? And what are those types of warning signs? And then getting into the dangerous ones where they're kicking things, throwing things, hitting, they're doubling up their fist. They might be grabbing objects to use as weapons. So being able to have policies and procedures in place for the staff to be able to recognize each one of those circumstances and be able to respond in those. So training on those policies and procedures are certainly going to be very important in theirs. Having protocols for the threat response. The employees need to know not only how to recognize it, but how to respond when they do recognize those scenarios. And de-escalation, are they able to bring that back? If it's an accelerated, are they able to get it back to an early warning system to where it's just a verbal altercation? And then the employee harassment policy. While it protects employees from harassment in your employee handbook, what's the policy for when you have clients, visitors, guests, customers, or a vendor that might be harassing your employee? So do you have another policy that also takes into account those types of scenarios? And what do you do with that? When you get into those, I'm noticing that my screens are doubled up here. I'm sure most people see the individuals here. This is a usual typical start of the week for Monday. And again, those policies are you need two different policies. Your employee handbook protects the employees from other employees, but then what is the policy for those that are not employees? They're guests to your particular property. When you get into your employees, you're looking at these same things. These are going to be employees, could be a past employee, they're a disgruntled employee coming back. A lot of these relate to interpersonal conflicts or relationships. So when you get friction between supervisors and employees, that can tend to escalate pretty quick. So having the employee violence, it's just a growing issue. More than 2 million cases a year, all combined. But many of those are employee on employee type activities. So, and the violence again, as OSHA points out, that's a combination of verbal, the written, the emotional, physical. It's a combination of all. So when you're looking at your policy, you do need to address each and every one of those aspects. So some of the prevention things to look at is performing new hire background checks. That's easier said than done sometimes. HR goes out of their way to be able to make calls and find out more about the background. And sometimes when you're contacting past employers, you don't get a lot of information because they're in fear of retaliation or potential liability for maybe putting too much information out there. So many times previous employers, and probably it might be your own policy, you're only providing the dates of employment, what the last position was, and whether or not they're eligible for rehire. So you're not going to get a whole lot out of there, but it's important to also listen to what the other individual might be saying, what they might allude to, whether or not there's a red flag thrown up. Being able to look at what's the frequency. Are they a job hopper? Are they do they have long-term type employments? Looking at all of those, and you're really going to have to be an investigator to dig into those a little bit. And having a no tolerance harassment and violence policy. This is one you probably want to talk with your legal department about. Sometimes they're called zero tolerance policies. Sometimes they're called no tolerance policy. So your legal department should be asked what the appropriate wording is for your setup. Many times, some legal scholars prefer not to utilize zero tolerance. They feel that that might have some type of opening into a liability. So, so the alternative to that I've widely used out there is a no tolerance policy. So, and then if an employee has a complaint on a harassment or some type of violence activity, do they know where and how to file those complaints? Does that go to security? Does it go to HR? Does it go to the manager? You want to make sure at the very beginning on the new hires and regularly throughout the year that the employees know how to handle and how to address any type of concern they might have as it relates to harassment or violence. So, and regular training is very imperative on the success of that program. It needs to be a repetitive action. So you certainly want to be able to address that time and time again. One time a year for the mass and global is wonderful, but then are there identifiers that you can put out there? Maybe there's a place card you can put near the time clock just to kind of remind them of the program. So you want to instill those little aspects so that it adds strength to your program that you might have in place. Making sure your employee handbooks have clear expectations and also outlining what the violation of consequences might be in the event they do violate that harassment or violence policy. Knowing that out front really helps. And it also helps not only to the aggressor to an extent, because certainly you're going to have that 1% that will violate that, but it also helps empower the employees that might be the victim of those. So outlining that does work in both ways. So it's important to make sure that those handbooks are kept current and up to date and clear and precise. The other aspect that sometimes stands out there is get to know your employees. Doesn't mean that you have to get into their business, know what they do after hours and stuff. But sometimes management and supervisors, they really don't know their employees. So if you don't know your employees, then it's going to be hard to tell if there's something wrong, if there's something bothering them. So spend some time, get to know them and communicate with them so that you can kind of get a gauge on their demeanor. And so that when a red flag does come up as a supervisor manager, you'd be able to take appropriate actions or be able to ask appropriate questions to be able to help maybe identify what that issue might be, and if that's something within your realm that you can assist with. So, and certainly making sure to evaluate your property's security measures and look for gaps in your security for whether it's an entry, it's the access, or again, the lighting around the building and the parking lot. The other aspect to look at is, do you, inside your employee handbook, have you established a no trespass policy following a termination? One of the aspects that we've seen in different types of entities out there or programs is that it's many of the employee handbooks are silent on that. When you think about that, if you terminate an employee today and they become upset, agitated, and they have an opportunity to let that fester, what prevents them from coming back to the business tomorrow? If you've identified that you have no trespass policy within some organizations put 30 days no trespass following date of termination, and that gives a cool down period. And in the event there is a violation to that policy and the former worker does come back, that could be a criminal trespass charge. So you have ways to be able to utilize your policies to be able to help prevent and offset particular situations that might develop. This is certainly a good policy to also talk with your legal department and your legal team and find out how that might best work within your written programs. And then you get into the final fourth one, the domestic violence and prevention. These may not necessarily begin within your organization, but they occur with your employee, and it could be off-site and something that could come back on-site. And this goes back to your general duty clause. While they're at work, you know, as the employer, you do have that general duty to keep them safe and secure from any types of harm. So domestic violence does come back into the workplace. I've had situations and scenarios where ex-former boyfriends have snuck into a casino past casino security and made it into the back of the house. No badges. They were able to access through doorways. Other employees helped point them in the direction to their former significant other. Those are certainly protocols that we thought we had in place and that we thought we had covered in our training. But it was clear that after discovering that somebody was able to get into the back of the house, that we needed to address those situations. We needed to improve our program, pull it out, and actually break it down and reevaluate. Did we have it? Was it crystal clear? You know, what failed on our system and our program to allow an individual to get past security into a secured location? Stalking, that also happens. Maybe the individual isn't even aware of who that is. They're just aware they're being stalked. Is the employee fearful of walking through the parking lot back to their car? These are things when we talk about management and supervisors getting to know your employees a little bit. And so you can find these triggers and you're looking for those types of items. So are you able to, do you have protocols in place or employee assistance programs in place? You're able to provide them information and resources and referral services to assist the employee. You know, do you have National Violence Hotline on hand, or do you have a list of local resources that you've developed on your own that might be able to help the employee? Those should already be developed and readily available. And again, not just with HR, but those are things to be able to post on the employee board, bulletin board, maybe near a time clock, maybe in the locker room. It's good to have those resources identified out there because sometimes they're living in fear. They may not ask for that information, but if you have it open and obvious, then when they need it and they feel that they need it, they're able to grab those types of resources and hopefully be able to utilize them. You know, I've had friends that have been victims of domestic violence and have lost their lives. And it's certainly a rippling effect through not only through the family, their own family, but through their work family, the workforce. You know, so you don't want these activities to fall back over into your place of employment, because if an occurrence does happen on there, you know, what's to prevent the thought process of the remaining staff of how well are we really protected at work? So you want to make sure to cover this in your planning process. And if you're able to sit down, if they're willing to sit down and talk to you, can you develop a workplace safety plan? You know, figure out with them how best to be able to protect them while they're at work. You know, what are ways that you can put in? I had an employee one time came in after hours to go attend a department meeting. And as the department meeting was taking place, and of course the department's closed and it should have been secured, the manager in the midst of it was interrupted by somebody sitting in the back corner. Turned out to be somebody's significant other had snuck into the department meeting and disrupted the department meeting. No one knows how the individual made it in there. So these are different types of things that I've had to experience and overcome in the past. And so it's, you know, you're always going back, you're crossing the T's and dotting I's. You're always pulling out these plans and reevaluating them to make sure that you are covering these aspects. And meet with the management team. A lot of this boils back down to the core aspect, and that's developing a threat management assessment. You know, these are going to provide you insight into your program as well as the gaps in your program in areas that might need improvement. You know, whether it's within the building or on the property, it's security operations, maybe it's a policy development, and then being able to create emergency action and escape plans. Those are important aspects. You still have your emergency action plans. This does not take the place of it. This helps provide support to those plans. Being able to recognize and evaluate your training program. And again, as mentioned, making sure that the employees recognize behavior changes. What are the warning signs? And then is there control measures to reduce the probability of a violent act? So sometimes threat management assessments are called risk management assessments. In the business world, they're probably called SWOT analysis. Many times you'll hear them addressed as a SWOT analysis. Regardless of the type of entity that you're working at, one of those three format likely fits into your program. And it breaks down the same thing. What are the strengths of the program? What's the weaknesses? Where are the opportunities? And what are the threats? It's identifying those four opportunities as you're beginning to pull together an assessment of your property and your program or your place of employment. You do these to be able to identify both specific and non-specific types of threats. You know when you see a gun on the property, that's a specific threat. What about a non-specific threat? You might not know where that is. Maybe that comes from the elevated tier of a threat. You go from a verbal altercation to a physical altercation. Being able to analyze your vulnerabilities and your strengths and your weaknesses within your property, that will help you develop your plan and add strength so that you can add strength into your employment plan. Identifying your technical and manpower and your security requirements and trying to maximize the protection within your constraints. You're not going to be able to cover everything. You're not going to be able to afford to pay for everything. Those are certainly key and critical components, but you need to be able to identify those so that you can begin planning those out. It might be something that goes into a CapEx plan. It might be something that you can take care of now. You have to decide what situation is acceptable and what levels of risk are acceptable for your organization. When you're looking at the threat assessments, you're assessing your entire operation. You're looking for all those vulnerable components and being able to separate those and whether or not they might be in an existing program, whether it's your employee handbook, a standard operating procedure. You look back at what OSHA is saying, and they're saying that well-written plans implemented violence prevention program combined with engineering controls and admin controls plus training can reduce the incidence of violence. And I think that's kind of key and critical as you begin looking at threat management assessments, is trying to keep in mind as you're finding these vulnerable spots within your organization, does that fall to something that could be taken care of by an engineering control, administrative control, or through a training? So being able to look at your engineering controls, you've got your physical and your design aspects. Many times the architects that put together or assemble some of these programs, they're looking at what looks nice and what looks neat. And they're right, that could be the case. But as you're evaluating those physical design controls, you need to look at how well does that manage the threats for your organization. And again, looking back, whether the threat of robbery, maybe the guest being able to jump a counter, the employees and former co-workers, engineering controls are probably the #1 component to mitigate many of the threats that you might find as you're developing your management plan. So you're looking at your office layouts. When you're inside, many times your offices, they have it structured so that when somebody comes through your door, they're sitting down right in front of your desk. Think what ifs, and what if an employee or a guest came in and became volatile? are you able to get off of behind your desk, or is your employee able to get off of behind your desk and safely vacate that room? So these are things when you're looking at office layouts, taking into account those types of scenarios and situations. You don't want to be blocked into a corner and locked into a corner. So you need to look at all kinds of different aspects. Your surveillance cameras and your mirrors, whether or not your operation might need a metal detector. Public entities are certainly moving to metal detectors and X-ray machines. Those are two areas becoming more and more common in the workplace. So, again, increasing and improving the lighting system outside the facility, the parking lot. Those are all components that take into these strengths, if you will, into your plan. Securing entry points. If you have multiple entry points in a building, do you really need to have all those entry points? Or is that something that you can scale back and maybe only have a couple of entry points that can better then be controlled, and then keep the other ones for egresses? We've talked about the building layouts and can you see people leaving or entering the building? Some of the egress doors. It actually makes me nervous when I go to a retail store, a C-store, a gas station. When I open the door and I don't hear that bell go off or that buzzer alarm, it makes me nervous, because if the employee can't hear me coming in the door, who was there before me and are they still in that building? So those are the types of thoughts that are going through my head. So I certainly feel a sigh of relief when I see the employee, but at the same time, I feel concerned for them, that they might be in the back of the room, and many times they come out and they're surprised to see somebody at the counter because there is no audible warning system in there. Do they have a panic button? What's their emergency communication if they're working alone? How do they let someone know when they're in duress, or that they need emergency help? These are all types of things that need to take into consideration when you're looking at developing your engineering controls and trying to mitigate these types of activities. Sometimes just taking care of the vegetation around the building. Many times the buildings are designed, landscapers put a lot of thought into it. Again, it's not so much as functional, but as a visual aesthetic. And so in the security setting, vegetation can actually diminish your security of your facility. You're providing an obstructed views, or whether you're providing hiding spots. So looking around your facility and observing those aspects, make sure to document that into your plan. What did you find? What did you feel? Are you providing dark spots and hiding spots, utilizing just natural vegetation? So there's a purpose for vegetation, and there's good vegetation, there's bad vegetation. So you certainly want to be able to analyze that. The workstations, reception desk, and point of sale counters and stores, having those higher, making sure that they're elevated to the point that somebody can't get their knee up and over the top and be able to jump that. Is there a small window of opportunity to be able to do that point of sale? Or do you have open clear counters that they can utilize to get more of their body up and over? So you're looking at your layout. You're looking at what is the design of this, and are there obstructions to help prevent those types of activities, or even hinder the employee potentially escaping a harmful activity? We've mentioned the cameras and mirrors. Looking at secured passages and man traps. There's multiple different ways for engineering controls to take into there. Also, mass communication systems. How are you going to alert others about a threat or a danger? Looking at administrative controls, again, developing a no tolerance policy for violence and making sure that it's strictly enforced. That's one of the key areas that many times the policies fail. We go through great strides to develop wonderful policies, and we get them in place, but then there's no strict enforcement of those policies. So that's going to be key and critical, especially to supervisors and management, in making sure that those no tolerance policies are strictly enforced and that the staff is trained in those policies, whether it's their new hire orientation, onboarding, or doing refresher trainings, making sure that the staff is aware of those policies. And then again, the reporting procedures, the staff needs to be trained where to find those policies or those forms, who to report it to. Can they report it just by doing an email? Establish what those criteria are and get it known. Being able to have that policy once it's reported, making sure that it's immediately investigated and that the investigations are documented. It's also important, I found, to communicate back with the reporter, the individual that reported the alleged incident. Many times they'll do the report and then they don't hear anything back. How that comes back to the individual that made that report is that it got swept under the rug. Management supervisors, they didn't do anything about my complaint. That's how they feel. So in order to change that, you need to be able to report or communicate back with the reporter. You don't have to give them full details. Acknowledge to them that there has been an investigation and that there is a process taking place and that there are steps and measures that will be able to address their concerns and that you appreciate them taking the time to let that issue be known. So those are going to be very important. That's going to develop the employees' ability to trust in the management team, that you're going to have their back on the safety aspects. And then being able to develop employee assistance programs and making sure that those programs are known to all of them. So there are many different types of administrative controls. Do you have sign-in, badging for everybody, including your visitors and your vendors? The employees, are the picture IDs? Even in the public sector, when I was a village manager, I always had my utility teams, made sure I didn't want them going door to door without an appropriate picture ID. We were a small community, everybody knew each other, but they wouldn't know if I had a new hire or not. And so I didn't want to take that risk. So even a small community of 600, I made sure that we had all employees were badged up with an ID. And I think that's very important in making sure, establishing that security and relationship with whomever you may be working for or protecting. So can an employee, if they're concerned about going out into the parking lot on their own, is there an escort program that they could ask for, or a buddy system, or is there a way that they might be able to park closer to the building for a little bit? These are all different ways that management can utilize their authority in order to help reduce some of the potential risks. Signage. Many times you'll go up to, whether it's a gas station or a party store, I shake my head when I see that the windows are so full and covered with advertisements that you can't see inside. You can't see in through the windows, you can't see in through the doors. That provides opportunity for a threat, robberies. Lots of times, if you look at some of the photographs taken about a robbery taking place at a store. If you look in behind them, if you can see the windows and stuff, identify, what kind of things are blocking the point of sale counter. Can you really see the clerk behind there? Can you see through the windows? Can you see through the doors? How much light is on the outside? Many times those you'll find are diminished areas. And when that area diminishes, that increases the likelihood a robber might actually identify or aim for that particular property. Some of the signage might help also mitigate some of that. There's a no violence tolerance workplace. If you see something, say something type rules. Being able to put signs up like that can sometimes be a deterrent to some. Do you have alert words? In the health industry, many times, code white. That's going to let somebody know that there's an issue taking place that needs immediate emergency attention, needs backup, and needs some type of support to that particular employee. It could be any type of code word or anything to identify whether there's an issue or not. Can you develop a program such as that? And would that work in your type of an operation, such as a retail store, or whether it's in the health setting, in a clinical setting? And then also, do you have a no trespassing policy for not just terminated employees, but what about ejected guests or customers or visitors? Is there a policy in place? In the casino world, when a guest or a customer is 86th, they're actually given in red the 86 policy that identifies that they're not permitted back onto the property, and now that they've been notified that they are not welcome back to the property, in the event they come back, that would be considered criminal trespass. That same type of policy can also apply into other operations, other types of entities. And so is there something that is developed to address those types of scenarios for the workplace and the non-employees? You start looking through some of the risk of assaults and harassments, many of that can be prevented or minimized if the precautions are taken. Making sure that harassment is part of the prevention program, that it's not just about physical assaults. And harassment, again, it could be verbal, it could be a visual, it could be, putting up comics that are off color, taking into consideration each one of those and making sure that each area is addressed. And then being able to investigate any and all those reports immediately and taking the appropriate action once the investigation is completed. If necessary, involve law enforcement. I've had to complete investigations on employee harassment complaints that at the conclusion of the investigation, we had to contact law enforcement on the aggressor. Because there was criminal contact. And so certainly we made sure to address that and bring in law enforcement at the same time. And that's for the protection of everybody. And again, when we get down into the training is going to be very key and critical to this. You've got to be able to get out there. It adds strength to the organization. It helps the staff, feel like they're part of this and that there's confidence. It builds that confidence in the employees to be able to do what's right and to know what to do when the appropriate time arises. So empower the staff in making sure that they have good training that will provide them confidence and direction. And it may have to be something that might be flexible. Again, active shooter incidents, even though that is still going to be part of the prevention plan that you have here, it's still in a standalone. You still have to look at the run, hide, fight, and then in your plan, as you're pulling those, assembling those management plans, can you identify safe rooms? Are there ways to be able to barricade those rooms? And a very important takeaway when it comes to the training, can't just do classroom training. You have to be able to practice. The employees need to be able to practice, to implement what they've been trained on. That's the only way you can really evaluate whether or not your training or your policies and program are really securing or taking and covering all the aspects. Practice is key and critical to all of that. And it can help quick actions that helps save the lives, and it provides the prevention of injuries and additional deaths. So when you're looking at your aspects, whether you're taken into three critical areas: the victim, the crime, or the desire for criminal activity, and what are the opportunities. So you're utilizing those as you're developing your plan in order to identify and address, again, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are the threats. Are you looking on what's the protocols for initial mass communications? Many times you're not going to be doing this alone. You have to talk with other people within the agency, within the organization, and even outside of that. What are your lockdown procedures? And when was the last time you tested it? Sometimes the facilities that are open 24 hours, they forget where the key is to lock the front door. So that's something to also bring up, and making sure that the organization knows, and that those security tools are immediately accessible. So there's some additional information and resources. OSHA has a few different things out there, workplace violence activities and checklist. And then also California Human Resource has a good program out there for workplace violence prevention guidelines and model program. And looking through that, it doesn't have to be California. That program and that model program would work anywhere, not just in California. So if you're in other states and have an opportunity, take a look at it and see if that might address some of your type of needs in your program.
Great. Thank you, Chuck. Very informative information that you provided here. And just for the attendees, we're going to get into our question and answer period. Again, as a reminder, to ask a question, you can go ahead and click on the questions tab and directly submit your question. We'll take and go through those in just a minute. We've got a couple that have come in, so go ahead and feel free to add your questions in at this point. A couple things, though, just to make sure that you're aware of, is we do have some handouts for this session. So if you click on the handouts, you will see that the presentation is there, as well as a checklist that's been provided for you as well. So I encourage you to take a look at those, and you can download those and review those at a later time as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and get into a couple questions. We have about 5 minutes left in the session. So again, add your questions and we'll get to those. So question number one is, it sounds like someone's developing a threat management assessment, and they really like some input on any other items or functions that they could add to the assessment form to really make it more robust.
Yeah, as we kind of hit on a little bit during the discussions, I think teamwork is very vital, and not just doing the assessment, but also developing that form. So being able to talk with other departments, and consulting with, whether it's security, law enforcement, IT, facility management, being able to talk with them about the security and about the types of hazards. They're probably already going to have some of that detail that you can identify and address in your form. And the assessment form that is attached in this presentation, that's left in Word. Currently it's set up to skewer a little bit towards healthcare and about clinical, but that can be added to. So those are good examples. Those are good questions to be able to review and then be able to edit it to make sense with your organization. In addition to that, I think what's very important in the form is to be able to provide a spot to add photos. So when you're doing the documentation of your findings, you can identify and put photos of what that concern might be. So if there's a threat, if there's a weakness, can you take a photograph of that? And so when you're putting that form together, you may want to leave space in there.
Great. Thank you, Chuck, for that feedback. Got another question that's come in. Looks like these are mostly around the threat management. What next steps should be considered after completing a threat management assessment?
So I think the starting point on that is you have to identify how and who is going to do the review or the evaluation of the assessment. So with that, you need to probably start thinking about developing a review team. And then from that, you're going to collect and review current administrative policies and also related training programs that you might already have. Those are going to be good starting points as well. Also don't forget to talk with your employees, the frontline staff, and determine if they have any concerns or if they've noted any concerns. They work in this every day. They're out there. They recognize this because it's a hands-on approach to them. So they're going to be a great tool and resource to you. So certainly don't forget about them. And then afterwards, also determine how you're going to define or score or evaluate your findings. With any risk matrix application, is there a low, moderate, high risk? Are you going to use a point system? What works best for your structure? I find that one of the things, sometimes those evaluation or score points, they'll only give you 3 opportunities of scoring, 1, 2, 3, or low, moderate, high. I encourage maybe considering, does it make more sense to maybe have a 5-point system so that you can have a little bit more, I guess, detail or strength into that and being able to evaluate your score. And then finally, determine if there are items or issues that can be immediately resolved or reduced that you've already identified in your threat management assessment, such as doing repairs or maintenance. There may be things that you can address at that time to be able to reduce what you're actually going to break down into.
Excellent. Thank you, Chuck. And we have time for one more question here. After completing a threat management assessment, who or how should it be reviewed within the organization?
As we just talked about, developing a multi-person review team with different disciplines and background makes the most sense. You certainly probably want your risk and safety manager involved, but you also need to make sure that you have executive management or management with power and authority to make change. So your general manager, your CEO, COO, somebody of that nature really needs to be brought into this circle and be part of that team. And then as we talked about capital expenses, sometimes these engineering controls are going to have a cost. So you want to certainly make sure to involve your CFO or accounting representative and making sure that they're in there. Because if you are finding some weaknesses, it could take financial investment in order to resolve those situations. So again, you want to make sure that your CFO's in there. Facility managers, they know the facilities inside and out, through the outside, through the inside. They can help guide and address some of the concerns or issues that might be out there that you might have to overcome during this. IT manager, we talked about communication, emergency response, mass response. IT managers will be able to tell you what is going to be able to work, whether it's by cell phone, computer systems. They're going to be able to help guide and be able to mitigate some of those threats that you might have identified as a weakness or a threat. So, and then certainly if you have security, if not, bring in law enforcement. They'll certainly also be able to help address those, or maybe point out areas that might be overlooked or overshadowed by other areas. Maybe you're looking at a particular threat and scoring it higher, and they might be able to look at that as a third-party objective reviewer and say that there might be something of a higher concern before that one. And then lastly, again, talk with the employees. Can you have an employee or an employee representative take part in that team? They're the front line. They know the bells and whistles. They know every screw, every little nook and cranny of your facility and operation. So utilize them as a tool in developing these threat management assessments and taking care and resolving any of those weaknesses or threats.
Well, excellent. Thank you, Chuck, for a great presentation today, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We hope this presentation has been beneficial for you and your staff. If you missed any portion of it, the link to the recorded webinar will be emailed this afternoon. And as a final reminder, our next webinar is on November 11th, where we'll focus on property vulnerabilities, understanding hazards, exposures, and mitigation principles. The announcement will be sent out 1 week prior to the event. So with that, we are going to end the session, and we thank you for your participation and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.